Hello, folks. The Civil War is over. The United States Army has defeated the states in rebellion in the South, and the country now needs to be put back together. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. The term that's used for the post-Civil War era is Reconstruction, which is a little confusing. The country is changing. And yes, the South has been devastated by the destruction of the Civil War. Most of the fighting took place in the South and in the Southwest. The South is devastated in the sense that $4 billion worth of enslaved labor was liberated. That was worth more than all the other industries in the country combined at the time. All of the infrastructure is in ruins, especially if you think about Sherman and the March to the Sea, where they destroyed railroad tracks and burned crops and destroyed buildings and all that. This is actually, I believe, a picture from Atlanta where a fire was set to destroy their own cotton crop by the Southerners, and it kind of spread through the city. So it does need to be rebuilt physically, but that's not what Reconstruction means, because Reconstruction means not that the government is going to help assist in that building. Instead, what it means is that they're going to design a society and try to reconstruct a society in order to protect the freedmen. Now, what are the freedmen? Those are the liberated Black Americans in the South, most of whom stayed very close to where they had been enslaved previously. There are a few exceptions, which we'll talk about. The North is going to be radically changed as well, because the North had been funneling money into industrial development during the war in order to produce things like, guns and bombs and uniforms and boots and processed food. So all of that money had gone into the northern factories, helps redevelop the North into a more industrialized society. So what does Reconstruction mean here? Well, it doesn't mean that the South is going to be rebuilt physically. It means that they're changing the South to protect the freedmen's rights. The first effort at this plan is Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan, often called Presidential Reconstruction. This is seen as a pretty weak effort later on by what we're going to call the Radical Republicans. Under Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan, only 10% of the voting population in the South had to swear a loyalty oath. Once 10% of that voting population swore a loyalty oath, then the states could re-enter the Union with all rights and privileges therein. Supporters of this plan saw it as a fair and generous peace offering. Folks, the Civil War cost 7.5% of the population their lives. Anywhere between 800,000 and 900,000 people died. And if you were to prorate that to today's standards, that's nearly 13 million people, 7.5%. So a fair and generous peace offering for a group of people who are trying to overthrow the legitimate government of the United States through violence, which killed 7.5% of the population. Wow, that is pretty fair and generous. Now, the congressional Republicans, which we're going to call the Radical Republicans, because they're going to be even more extreme in their views on what needs to happen. They wanted to punish the Southerners for causing all this death and destruction for the purpose of extending slavery. So they're angry that the rebels are being allowed to re-enter quickly and not really facing any consequences. And they're also angry because former rebellious leaders, sometimes like Alexander Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, was reelected to Congress. Former rebellious leaders and obvious white supremacists were being allowed back into power too quickly, and there was no protection set aside for the freedmen. There were some efforts to help them. Now, I think what's important to recognize here, the freedmen are not ignorant. They're not incapable. They're very skilled, actually, at farming. Some of them are skilled leaders. Some of them are skilled readers, writers. Some of them are skilled thinkers. We know this because we have data on this. What they don't have is resources. They didn't have money. They'd been enslaved. They didn't have land because the plantation owners owned it all. They didn't have horses. They didn't have seeds. They didn't have an education. They just lacked resources. They're not somehow second class. Those resources had been intentionally denied to them during the age of enslavement as a way to keep them subservient. So the federal government does try to do some things, like the Congressional Radical Republicans pass an act for what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a federal organization that was created to try to help the freedmen adapt into their new lives. It's going to give them necessary and direct aid, meaning assistance, help. It's going to give them to individuals, and it is actually going to apply to non-Black Americans as well. But for the most part, this is designed to help those freedmen adjust to life outside of enslavement. It's going to help them negotiate labor contracts because they need somebody that is skilled in the law, that knows the law, that has been educated in the law. It's going to help them try to reunite people with their former families. Remember, part of the horrors of slavery was families just broken apart for no other reason than the landowner had to pay off debts. At best, at worst, it could be because they're trying to punish one of the enslaved. So they're going to try to reunite families. They're going to try to legalize marriages. There were marriages on the plantation, but they were never recognized legally. So now they're going to try to recognize legal marriage. There's going to be medical care, food, clothing, and most importantly, you can see that in this picture right here, what are called Freedmen's Bureau schools. Education was incredibly important to the freedmen. They had been denied education, so one of the first things they did was build schools. One of the next things they did was build churches. They wanted to get away from the prying eyes of the white overseers and try to take all this on their own. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau does hire white teachers from the north, mostly women, to come down, but quickly those white women are going to be replaced as well. So all of this is happening, and then within a few months of his inauguration, a few weeks of his inauguration, April 14th, 1865, Lincoln's death by assassination by John Wilkes Booth is going to pave the way for a more radical Reconstruction. Actually, not in the way you think. Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president. He was a Tennessee Southerner. He has all of the same beliefs of most of the other Southerners, but he was a Unionist and he stayed loyal to the Union. So as vice president, as a Southern vice president, he is going to try to slow a lot of those protections that were meant for Black Americans. Here's Andrew Johnson. Let me slide my face under here. Andrew Johnson is going to take Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, and he's going to add a couple of things. First, he wants to add this idea that the states had to accept the 13th Amendment, which would have ended slavery, in order to be allowed back into the Union. Now, the 13th Amendment was already adopted, and the states just had to accept it. I believe it was Mississippi that didn't accept this until 1954, something like that. And the second thing that he did was needed to have the wealthy ask him for personal forgiveness. So if you were a leader of the Confederacy, if you were a wealthy person, you had to ask him for personal forgiveness. This is mostly because he wanted to rub it in that he picked the right side, whereas those other wealthy folks in the South did not. Now, once they did that, the states could reform their state governments. Note, there is no protection of the freedmen. There is no voting rights put in here for the freedmen. And what this would do is quickly allow white supremacist governments to be reformed in the South. And that's exactly what happens. Let's see. Oh, let's quickly mention the 13th Amendment. It ends the system of enslavement, says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So it ends the system of enslavement, but you'll see that little underlined part up there. That's going to be, we're going to talk about the convict leasing system next time. It also says Congress shall have the power to enforce. So unlike the Bill of Rights amendments, which was limiting the power of the federal government, this amendment right here, this is giving the federal government more power over the states. This is necessary because this, combined with the 14th Amendment, is going to overturn the Dred Scott case. Remember the Dred Scott case was the one that said African Americans were not considered citizens and therefore had no right to sue and were never intended to be citizens. Well, this act right here, this is overturning that Dred Scott case. And that's all fine and dandy, except for the fact that white supremacists are now retaking those southern states. And a lot of those states had clauses in there that still specifically disenfranchised Black Americans. Those former rebellious states were sending Confederates back to Congress. They were filling their state governments with former Confederates and former enslavers. And they started passing what were called black codes. Now, black codes were laws specifically designed to keep African Americans subordinate to the white population. You can see this here. This was drawn in 1866. Justice is blind, right? That's fair. But as we keep telling my kids, equal doesn't necessarily mean fair. So we're looking for equity here, which means people get what they need, not everything is equal. So justice being blind is actually leading to the loss of freedom for the African Americans because, according to law, white Americans were the ones that were in charge here. So, for example, this is a Mississippi Black Code. All freedmen, free Negroes, mulattoes, over the age of 18, found with no lawful employment or business, and all white persons, usually associating with freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes in terms of equality, shall be deemed vagrants, and on conviction thereof shall be fined and imprisoned at the discretion of the court. In other words, they're controlling the movement and populations of not only the freedmen, but people that would have supported the freedmen, specifically targeting the Black population. And it's meant to maintain racial separation, right? Notice that line about associating with freedmen. So if you were a person that was just kind of hanging out in the same area as a freedman, and you were a white person, you'd be associated with them and could be fined as well. And this is all meant to support white supremacy. Johnson is going to, remember, the Southern vice president, now president after Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson battles with Congress in order to try to prevent freedoms for the Black Americans. But in the 1866 election, the Republicans get what they call a supermajority. Republicans get a majority, and then in 1866 they get a supermajority. Which means the radical Republicans can basically do what they want without Johnson really being able to stop them. They push through the 14th Amendment, which guarantees birthright citizenship, which means anybody born within the United States is considered a citizen. That means that the freedmen born in the Americas were automatically citizens, and it gives them equal protection under the law. This also helps overturn Dred Scott versus Sanford. Congress takes charge of Reconstruction at this point as well. And we're going to move into what's called radical Reconstruction, which is not the Republicans trying to punish the Southerners, is trying to protect the freedmen because the Southerners had proven that they were going to try to re-implement white supremacist governments. So we start what's called congressional or radical or military Reconstruction. Now, according to the radical Reconstruction, they undid the presidential Reconstruction and sent military governors into a new divided South in order to try to protect the rights of freedmen. So they divided the southern states, those states formerly in rebellion, into 5 new districts. They sent military governors in there, specifically bypassing Andrew Johnson. South Carolina was here in District Number 2. And they would stay under the control of the military until they had created constitutions that would protect the freedmen's rights. And that's what happens in 1868 in South Carolina. Now, Johnson is going to face an impeachment, but impeachment just means to be put on trial. Please don't mix that up. It doesn't mean that the president is removed from office. Johnson is put on trial. Partially, the legal reason was because he fired somebody without a permission of Congress, but the actual reason was because Johnson was obstructing congressional Reconstruction plans. He had been a thorn in the side of these radical Republicans, and they were going to really stick it to him and try to get him out of office and put somebody else in. So they impeach him. It goes all the way to the final vote, and he is not removed from office. At this point, though, he basically lets the congressional Republicans do whatever he wants because he knows that he could be removed from office. They fell 1 vote shy, and that 1 vote was also a radical Republican. Grant wins in the election of 1868 anyways. He is a Republican, and the Republicans are going to control most of the state governments in the South by the 1870s. And you have the Republicans in the South being white Northerners, the freedmen themselves who were given the new voting rights, and there was a sizable portion of pro-Union Southerners in the South. So Reconstruction is really going to begin around 1868. And the radical Republicans try to solidify their gains by passing the 15th Amendment, which provides the right of citizens of the United States to vote, and it shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And you see pictures like this one here, which, that one there, which shows an African-American, a line of African-Americans actually, lining up to vote in the election. But that leaves some very suspicious loopholes. Race, color, previous condition of servitude doesn't include anything about, poll taxes or literacy clauses. So we'll come back to that next video. So life in the South during Reconstruction. The African Americans, the freedmen are freed, but they're not equal yet. They're still going to be living in areas of white supremacy. Black veterans and ministers are going to become the majority of the political leaders. After Reconstruction ends, there's going to be this effort to claim that the freedmen were ignorant and uneducated and unable to run a government, and that they were corrupt, and a lot of racist tropes will be used. But that's not really true. That is something that happens later to try to justify the reemergence of white supremacy that comes in after Reconstruction fails. White Southerners are afraid, and they try to terrorize and intimidate the African Americans, assuming that the freedmen are going to try to terrorize the white populations, because that's what they had done to the black populations during slavery. So they try to get ahead of it, and they try to terrorize and intimidate, and that's going to lead to things like the Ku Klux Klan. But here's what they were actually doing. I didn't know I could do that. Here's what they were actually doing. The African Americans were trying to create community, or trying to solidify the community that already existed in the enslaved time period. Marriage rates explode among the black community. They understood the value of family. Church membership is way high, and it becomes central to the black community. Education was a central focus, understanding that it had been denied to them during enslavement, and they saw it as a path to social status and rising up through society. And like I said, white Southerners were terrified of an educated black population that might seek to better themselves socially and economically, or even leave the South for opportunities elsewhere. Now, why is that a problem? Well, they needed somebody that would go out and help pick the crops. African Americans do enter politics. This is the radical Republican Congress of the state legislature of 1868 in South Carolina. This image here. The state legislatures began to look like the populations that elected them. South Carolina was a majority black state in 1868, and look at that. They got a majority black state legislature. It is the first African-American congressman elected during this time period as well. There's going to be a handful, 7 or 8, that will be elected to the U.S. Congress. And like I said, white supremacists are constantly going to be trying to spread rumors about the corruption and drunkenness of the African Americans that did gain power, and eventually they're going to turn to violence in order to try to retake the South and what they call a redemption. So just real quick, the Reconstruction Amendments: 13th Amendment ends slavery. 14th Amendment is birthright, citizenship, and due process rights. The 15th Amendment is the right to vote that can't be taken away on race, color, previous condition of servitude, with the overall goal here being to recognize the basic civil liberties of African Americans. That is the society that they're trying to reconstruct, not trying to rebuild the stuff that was damaged during the Civil War, but reconstruct or change society to protect the basic civil liberties of African Americans. Now, the limits, the freedom of white supremacists to allow the freedom of African Americans to grow, right? So sometimes limiting a freedom is going to allow liberty to flourish in other areas. All right.